Hello guys, and welcome to Landscape Photography Tips episode number 5. So today I'm going to be talking about how to shoot into the sun. So shooting into the sun can be really rewarding, especially during that golden hour at sunrise or sunset, but it can cause a whole host of different problems. So today I'm going to talk about those problems, how we can work those problems out, how we can eradicate those problems in the field and during post-processing as well. Now I think, learning about photography is, it's an ongoing process. You never stop learning, and the best way to learn is to practice. With that in mind, I've got a couple of shots that I'll be using in post-processing, and I'm going to make those shots available for you as well, so you can download those images and we can work along the post-processing stage together, follow along together. So let's talk about safety first. Now, if you're using a DSLR, you certainly don't want to be looking through the viewfinder, especially with a telephoto lens at the sun. The sun's going to be magnified as it comes through the viewfinder. I definitely recommend selecting live view and looking at the live view on the back of the camera. You're looking at a digital image, it's not going to hurt your eyes. If you're using a mirrorless camera, then you don't need to worry about that at all. Obviously the viewfinder is a digital image anyway, but yeah, just bear in mind if you're using a DSLR, do not look through the viewfinder. So let's talk about dynamic range for a second. So if you're pointing our camera towards the sunlight, the dynamic range of the image will be massive if we have some foreground elements as well. So if we're exposing for the sky, it's likely that our foreground elements will be very dark indeed. So what we can do to combat this is use auto exposure bracketing. That's going to take multiple shots of the scene at different exposure values, and we'll be able to blend those images together when we get back to post-production. So I would normally take a fairly evenly balanced exposure, something that's in the middle really, and then I would set my bracketing feature up to shoot 2 stops overexposed and 2 stops underexposed with 1 stop increments. So basically I've got 5 stops of light covered in that one kind of bracketing exposure setting, if you like. So 5 different shots. 1 stop under, 2 stops under, the balanced exposure, 1 stop over and 2 stops over. That's going to give us a much more balanced image when we get back to post-processing. We can put all those images into the HDR blending feature within Lightroom or Photoshop, and then we'll be able to get much more dynamic range from that image, and it's going to be able to create a really balanced exposure overall. Now, another bonus about exposure bracketing is we can use our lens hood, which we can't use if we're attaching filters to the front of our camera. So a lens hood like this one here will stop the glare on the front of the lens, and it will also stop some lens flare as well, which can really help create a better, crisper, sharper image overall as well. So not only is the exposure bracketing going to be able to let us capture more dynamic range by putting the lens hood on the front as well, we're going to get probably a clearer image overall as well, which is going to help obviously the final image. So another thing to consider obviously whenever we're shooting landscapes is our aperture. Now generally I'm shooting at around f8 probably for a landscape shot, trying to keep as much of that scene in focus as possible. And obviously, shooting into the sun, the smaller the aperture, the less light that's going to come through the lens as well, so that's going to be more beneficial. Now, if we stop the aperture right down to say f16 or f22, what we'll find is that sun will start to leave light trails around it, and we'll get that kind of starburst effect that can be really cool. You can use this to your advantage as well. If you position the sun behind a tree or a mountain, you get these streaks of light coming around the edge of that object, and it can create some really cool effects actually. Now, one thing I would say, if you do stop your aperture down to say f16 or f22, as the light passes through the lens, that light will diffract as it passes through the very small aperture. And as it diffracts the light, it's going to make your image a lot softer, so you're going to lose detail. So it's something to consider when you do shoot towards the sun. If you're going to include starbursts, you might want to decide also to take another shot of that scene as well at a wider aperture to make sure you can get all that crisp detail. So if you've got some rocks or something down in the foreground that you want to include, maybe shoot that at f8 and then stop down the aperture, take another shot with the starburst effect in the background. That will give you more options when you get back to post-production. So there's nothing worse than a soft foreground. So let's talk about filters, and particularly neutral density graduated filters. Now these can be very effective when you're shooting into the sun. They'll allow you to reduce the exposure in the sky whilst being able to still get a balanced exposure with your foreground. So as you can see here, we've got this neutral density graduated filter. You can see it's darker at the top and it's completely see-through at the bottom with no darkness at all. So we can position this within our shot and we can reduce the exposure value of the sky but not the foreground or land. Now, Using graduated filters are fantastic. I love using them. I absolutely love getting it as near to perfect as possible in the camera. I feel it's a little bit more artistic. I really enjoy using them. That being said though, they do produce a lot of problems. Now, neutral density filters are great. You can pop them into the filter holder like so and move that dark edge down to the horizon and obviously get your even exposure. Problem with it is though, if you're shooting a mountain scene or a woodland scene, quite often you'll have things that are sticking up in the horizon. Now, this is only really good if you've got a very straight horizon. That dark edge will be perfect if it's a seascape, but if you've got a big mountain sticking up, it's obviously going to darken that mountain as well, and you probably don't want that to happen. So neutral density filters are great in some circumstances, but other circumstances, they're just not a viable option at all. So I would always go down the route of, if I can use a neutral density graduated filter, I will do. If I can't, then I'll HDR bracket. I don't mind using either technique. I think there's a tool for every job. Now, when we come to using filters, it does pose another problem. Obviously, we can't use that lens hood that we talked about earlier, and we will get lens flare and glare within the front of this filter if we're not careful. Obviously, the better quality filters that you've got, the better chance you've got of reducing that flare. These filters that I use, the Firecrest range, have got coatings on them that reduce that glare, but the cheaper filters don't have that, and you'll tend to get reflections within the lens element as well, and it can look pretty poor actually in a lot of circumstances. Now, what I would do if you're shooting towards the sun is just literally, instead of using the lens hood, just use your hand to shade the sun like this, and you can get a very similar to effect if the sun's coming over from the side by just positioning the hand over the front of the lens there. It will do the same thing. Quite often I use my filter case as well because it's a little bit larger. Just take that over the top of the lens to reduce any flare on the front of the filter, and that works really well. So let's talk about lens flare. So sometimes you just cannot eradicate the lens flare from your image. It depends on the angle of the sun pointing towards the lens. Now, regardless whether you've got a filter on or not, or even if you've got your lens hood on, sometimes you just cannot get rid of this lens flare. And when this happens, you really only are left with one other choice, and that's blending images together. Now, if this is the case, then I'm quite happy to do that. And this kind of leads me on to the post-processing that we'll be doing a bit later. But first of all, I'm going to show you kind of how I go about setting this up if you've got that lens flare in the image. So basically, what I'll do is I'll take two different shots. I'll take one shot of the sky exposed for the highlights in the sky. So I've got an evenly balanced sky, not worrying about the foreground at all. And I'll take that shot. Now, just make sure you've got all of the settings in manual. You want your white balance in manual, all of your other settings in manual, dial your exposure in, take the shot, use a 2-second timer, make sure you got it on a nice sturdy tripod. You're not going to move the tripod. When you finish taking the shot, we'll then expose for the foreground, so we'll expose for the land, making sure that it's still believable. We don't want the exposures to be completely different. We don't want a nice dark sky exposed for the highlights and a ridiculously bright foreground. Blending those two images together will just look like we've just stuck two images together, and we don't really want that. We want to try to make it look as realistic as possible, as natural as possible, and as pleasing to the eye as possible as well. So expose for the foreground, and then what I do is take my filter holder. It's got a nice straight edge on it. You can use a book as well, and then I just take this and I just position it down to the horizon level, and then I take my shot, and that's going to completely cover the top half of the sky. Now, I've seen some people use a finger to do this as well. You can pop your finger over the sun and that will take out the lens flare, but what I've found is my finger wobbles about a bit. Sometimes I get my finger in the land part as well. It's a little bit more difficult to control, and also if you use something which completely covers up the whole of the sky, it's eradicating any of that glare entering the front of the lens as well. You can kind of shield the sun and kind of use it as a lens hood as well. So completely block out all of the sky and take the shot. Again, everything in manual, 2-second timer, and take that image. You will be left with an image there of the land that doesn't have any lens flare in it at all. So that kind of brings me on to the post-processing stage. So what we're going to do is going to blend these two images together. You can go and pick these images up from my website. I'll leave the link in the description for that. Nip over there, grab those couple of photos, guys. I'll make my way back to the studio while you're downloading them, and then we'll go through the post-processing stage, how I blend these images together. We'll do a bit of selective dodging and burning, some selective sharpening as well to really bring out the details in the landscape and make a really nice, stunning sunset image. So I've come out to shoot a video about shooting into the sun, and it's absolutely hammering it down. What can you do? Hey, what can you do? British weather, don't you just love it, eh? Wow, that just did not go to plan at all. But anyway, let's crack on with the editing. Okay, so photography is subjective, isn't it? You know, everybody's view on how photographs should be edited is going to be slightly different. This is just the way I do it. Hopefully, if it helps you out, that's great. And if you learn something, that's even better. So, yeah, if you've downloaded the images, yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to bring them into Photoshop now. So as you can see here, we've got the first image up. We've got the lens flare in the image. We want to get rid of that, don't we? So let's go over onto our other image here, and we can see here that we've got this land nicely exposed and got all the detail looking nice and sharp and crisp. So you're going to select all of this image here by pressing Control A or Command and A if you're on the Mac, then press Control and C to copy it, and then we're going to go back to our other image and press Control and V to paste that image in. Now, as you can see, that's put that layer on top of our background layer. So this is our image where we're going to be using the foreground. What we're going to do first is align the layers. So come up to, first of all we need to select both of these layers. Just press Control, click on both of them, and then edit, and then come down to auto align layers and just click OK, and it should just quickly align those layers just to make sure we've got both layers on top of each other perfectly aligned. That's going to help us just blend those images together, especially when we kind of paint along the horizon level. If the camera's moved, then there might be a little bit of difference in the images. So let's click on layer 1 first. We're going to add a layer mask to that, and if we click on the layer mask, it's just going to drop a white mask on there. As you can see, that hasn't done anything. What we need to do is come and click on our brush. We can either press B on the keyboard or come up and select it here, and then we just need to make sure that we've got black selected as our primary colour in the colour picker there. So basically what we're going to do is select the brush, make sure our opacity is at 100, and then our feathering, we want a fairly feathered brush, something like that. And I'm going to click here in the image to start with, and then I'm going to hold shift down and I'm going to click over on this side, and that's going to draw a straight line right across the image, and then I'm just going to freehand paint out the rest of that white layer mask. And as you can see down here in the mask, we've completely covered the sky with black paint on the mask, and that's just revealing the layer below. You can just see the image below there, and that's obviously the two layers weren't quite lined up together. What we're going to do now is just get rid of that with the crop tool, original photo, and just bring that in just slightly, just to get rid of that. What I'd like to do is actually just brighten this layer up a little bit. So I'm going to attach a brightness and contrast layer to just the top layer. Now if I adjust the brightness here, it's going to adjust the whole of the image. So what I'm going to do is select this little pin here and just pin it to that layer, and basically that's going to just adjust the brightness and contrast of just that layer. So now if you see it's just targeting the layer that the foreground, it's not targeting the sky. So that's just going to allow us just to bring up the exposure slightly in that bottom half. So next up, what I'm going to do is, I'm quite happy with how this is looking in terms of the exposure. It's nicely balanced. What I'm going to do now is, because I'm happy with how the image looks overall, I'm just going to flatten that image, and we can do that by pressing Control, Shift and E on the keyboard, or coming up to the layer and click Flatten Image. Now that's just flatten those layers down to 1, so we've just got one layer now to work on. Sometimes it's just the easiest way of doing things and it simplifies things. Obviously it is destructive, we can't go back and undo any changes, but
I don't feel like I need to make any changes to the brightness or contrast or anything like that of the image, and I'm happy with how the layers are blended together. So for this tutorial, just makes things a little bit easier to work on. Now what I want to do is some selective sharpening to the image. Now sharpening, I use unsharp mask. I think it's a really good way of doing it, and you can really control where you're going to apply the sharpening to, what area of the image you're going to apply that sharpening to. So we're going to be working on this duplicated layer. We're just going to come up to Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. Now I'm going to apply quite a lot of sharpening to this image to start with, and as you can see, you know, 'cause it's such a hazy image, there's so much mist and you know, water in the atmosphere, and that's what's creating this lovely haziness, but obviously it's reducing the sharpness of the image as well. So I'm going to apply quite a bit of sharpening to the bottom section of the image to start with, and I'm going to set my radius at 1, and probably I'm going to apply about 150% sharpness to the image. Now I'm going to apply a layer mask to that image. Now that's still applying the sharpening to the image, but what I'm going to do is brush out the sharpness in the top area of the shot. I don't really want to apply any sharpening to the sky, it's just completely pointless, so it's just accentuating any noise that's in the image basically. I really don't want to be applying any sharpening at all to this area here. So as you can see, that's just basically masked out the sharpening layer, and it's just revealing the layer below. So there's no sharpening in the top area, it's just applied that sharpening to the bottom, which is great. I'm happy with how that looks right now. I'm going to flatten this image again. Now I'm going to do a little bit of dodging and burning. So I'm going to come up to the dodge tool, and I'm going to affect my midtones, and I'm going to keep this really low at sort of 6%. And basically what I'm going to do now is just bring in some of that light that's hitting the side of the hill here, just here as well. Just want to bring out some of these details, and I want to accentuate the light hitting the top of this ridge line as well. Really bring out, it's just where it's kissing the top of that hill there. I want to just accentuate that a little bit, just a bit more, and through here in the trees, and also along the top of this row of trees. I mean, I'm doing this quite crude, you know, you could like really zoom into the image and you know, apply this in a lot more detail. As you can see with this image, guys, you know, if we zoom in, there's quite a bit of noise in this image. I think the reason for this is we're shooting directly into the sun, and it's very, very hazy. You know, the rest of this landscape here is not going to be sharp. There's so much moisture and atmosphere in the air that it's not going to be sharp. But you know, that for me completely adds to the image. It really does make the image, I think. It's so atmospheric. Really wouldn't want to alter that. You know, I could reduce the amount of noise in this image, and I think we'd lose contrast and stuff as well. But for me, I don't think it really matters. I think it kind of adds a little bit of just a bit of texture to the image as well. So I don't think that's a big problem. For this image, I actually focused down here on these trees. You can see these trees here are really sharp. I didn't focus, you know, stack or anything like that. I just thought if I focus here, you know, because there's so much haze, this is going to be like the sort of the point where, you know, it's going to be sharp anyway. Even if I focus down here in the background, it still wouldn't have been sharp just because of the amount of atmosphere, moisture and atmosphere in the air. So yeah, that was the decision I made at the time. But yeah, so there we have it, guys. That's pretty much it. Straightforward image blend and a bit of tweaking as well in post-production. You can obviously take this as far as you want to and have a little play around with it yourselves and see what you can come up with. If you decide that you want to share this image on social media, you know, I don't mind, you can do, but please, you know, just give us a mention and say that, you know, you got it from me, and that'd be great. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today, guys. I hope you got something from it. I hope you enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure to get out once again. It would have been nice to maybe actually capture some images today, but the weather closed in, and yeah, it just wasn't the day for shooting a video about shooting into the sun in the rain, basically. So what can you do? What can you do? So yeah, thanks again for watching, guys. Hope you got something from it. You know, like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and I'll see you next week.